I set out in late September of 2016, driving my old pickup down to the mountains of northern Idaho with my dog, a 3-year-old black lab named Tucker. The air had just started to cool down, and the forests were full of that dry, crisp smell of pine and dirt that I always loved this time of year. I had the back of my truck loaded with the basics: a tent, sleeping bag, some food sealed in containers, a small propane stove, and a rifle slung in the back rack more out of habit than expectation. I wasn't going hunting this trip. It was just me, my dog, and the quiet. I pulled off the main road in the late afternoon, following a rutted dirt track for a few miles before it finally opened up to a clearing not far from a narrow creek. It was the kind of spot I always looked for. No other camps around, no signs of people, no fresh tire marks. Just stillness. I killed the engine and Tucker immediately leapt out, nose pressed to the ground, tail wagging hard as he sniffed every patch of grass and pine needles he could find. I set up the tent slowly, making sure the stakes were driven in deep since the ground was hard and rocky under the layer of pine needles. The air was still, but I knew nights out there could turn windy fast. By the time I had my camp arranged, the sun was slipping low behind the mountains, throwing long shadows that made the clearing look deeper than it was. Tucker stayed close, circling and occasionally letting out low, short woofs at the treeline like he was warning it not to get too close. Dinner was a simple can of chili heated on the stove, eaten with crackers while Tucker sat by my feet crunching his dry food. When it got dark fast, the kind of blackness you only get far from any towns or roads. I had a fire going, but even with it, the trees around me looked like a solid wall of black. Tucker lay close to me, ears twitching at every little snap or rustle. I tried to read by headlamp for a while, but after an hour I packed it in. I smothered the fire, zipped up the tent, and stretched out inside my bag with Tucker curled at my side. I must have fallen asleep hard because the next thing I remember was waking up in the dead of night with Tucker growling, low and steady. His body was stiff against me, hackles raised. At first, I thought it might have been a deer passing nearby, but the way he was focused, ears forward, I knew it wasn't that. I sat still for a minute, trying to listen past the thump of my own heartbeat. Outside the tent, the forest was silent. No wind, no crickets, not even an owl. Just that kind of heavy quiet that feels wrong. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not the 4-beat pattern of a deer or elk, but 2 slow, deliberate steps on dry leaves. They stopped. Then another 2. They were close, too close, circling the tent. Tucker's growl deepened, and he pressed his nose hard against the nylon wall like he wanted to tear right through it. I stayed frozen, barely breathing, counting each faint step. Whoever it was, they were moving slow, pausing every few feet like they were listening. My mind went 100 directions at once, hunters, squatters, maybe someone living off the grid. But the way they moved, so quiet and careful, made my skin crawl. I reached for the rifle, though it was propped against a tree outside. Inside the tent, I only had my knife. My hand gripped it tight, though I wasn't sure what good it would do against someone out there in the dark. The steps went around one side of the tent, stopped for a long moment, then shifted again, lighter this time, like they were trying not to be heard. Tucker started barking sharp and fast, lunging at the wall of the tent. I held his collar, trying to keep him from ripping straight through it. Whoever was out there froze when he barked. Then I heard quick, heavy strides moving off into the trees until the sound disappeared into the distance. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat upright in the dark, knife in one hand, my other hand on Tucker's collar until he finally settled and lay down again, though his ears stayed pricked. Every little crack of a branch outside had me tightening my grip on the knife. The hours dragged until finally, pale light started to filter through the tent fabric. When I unzipped the door at sunrise, the clearing looked ordinary again, quiet and empty. But the ground around the tent told a different story. There were footprints in the dirt and pine needles, human ones. They circled the tent in a loose loop, some close enough that if I had pressed my hand against the nylon in the night, I could have touched whoever it was. What bothered me most was that the prints didn't come from the direction of the trail. They came straight out of the forest and vanished back into it on the opposite side. I packed camp fast. Tucker never stopped pacing, nose to the ground, tail rigid. He kept pulling toward the edge of the trees where the tracks disappeared, growling low in his throat. I wanted no part of whatever or whoever was out there. My hands shook as I shoved the last of my gear into the truck bed, barely taking time to make sure it was tied down. I didn't even bother with breakfast. As I drove out on the dirt road, tires spitting gravel, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see someone step out into the track behind me. But the woods stayed still. When I hit the paved road again, I finally let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding since the night before. Later, when I stopped at a gas station an hour down the highway, I got out to fill the tank and caught sight of something that froze me. The dust on the back bumper of my truck had a streak through it, a finger line drawn from one side to the other. I hadn't touched it, and I knew damn well Tucker hadn't either. Someone had walked right up behind my truck while I slept and dragged their hand across it. That was the last time I camped alone out there. I still take Tucker with me into the woods, but never without people I trust nearby. The mountains are wide and beautiful, but not everything you run into wants to leave you in peace. Sometimes the scariest thing out there isn't an animal or some made-up creature. It's another person, moving in the dark, watching when you can't see them. I was 24 years old when I decided to take a solo camping trip through the French countryside. It was late summer of 2017, the kind of season when the days were still warm, but the nights carried that faint chill that reminded you autumn wasn't far away. I had been traveling across Europe for a few months, moving mostly through big cities, and I wanted a break from the crowded trains, busy streets, and loud hostels. Camping seemed like a good way to reset, to find silence, and to test myself a little. I picked a spot outside a small village in southern France, not far from the Rhone River. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing I had found earlier that day after following a narrow trail that curved away from the road and into the trees. The ground there was mostly flat, a mixture of dirt and dry leaves, and the forest around me was thick enough to block the sound of the highway. Felt isolated, but not too remote. I figured I was maybe a mile or two away from the nearest farmhouses. I set up my tent in the late afternoon. The air was hot and heavy, the kind of weather that made sweat cling to your skin even when you weren't doing much. After staking down the tent, I laid out my sleeping bag inside and set my pack against the side. I had a small camping stove with me, so I boiled some water, poured it over a packet of noodles, and ate slowly as the shadows stretched across the ground. It felt peaceful at first. I could hear the hum of cicadas, the distant croak of frogs near the water, and the soft rustle of wind through the trees. As the sun dipped lower, I decided to walk a little deeper into the woods before it got too dark. I didn't go far, maybe 10 minutes in, just enough to stretch my legs. I noticed small things along the way, the crunch of acorns under my boots, the faint smell of smoke that suggested someone nearby might be burning wood, the occasional flutter of a bird startled by my steps. By the time I got back, the light had drained from the sky, leaving only that pale blue glow before full darkness. I crawled into my tent and turned on my headlamp, reading a paperback book until the words began to blur and my eyelids grew heavy. Sometime in the night, I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought it was just an animal moving through the brush. A deer, maybe, or a fox. I lay still, listening. The sound was soft, but steady. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the distinct rhythm of footsteps. They weren't quick, nervous steps like an animal would make. They were slow, human. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensing as I realized someone was walking near my tent. The footsteps circled slowly, dragging slightly as if the person was deliberately making noise. My heart thudded against my ribs. I told myself it could just be a hiker who'd gotten lost or someone from the village passing through. But deep down, it didn't feel right. No one wanders through thick woods at 2 in the morning unless they have a reason. The steps grew closer, stopping just a few feet from my tent. I could hear the faint crunch of dirt shifting, the subtle sound of breathing. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent. I just lay there frozen, gripping the handle of the small pocket knife I kept beside me. After what felt like forever, the steps moved again, slow, deliberate, circling the tent once more before fading back into the woods. I stayed awake until the first trace of dawn lit the sky. My nerves were shot, but nothing else happened. When the sun finally rose, I unzipped the tent and stepped out cautiously. The clearing looked the same as it had the day before, except for one thing. Faint shoe prints pressed into the dirt, right outside the entrance of my tent. They weren't mine. They were larger, wider, fresh. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it could have been some villager cutting through the woods, curious about my tent. Maybe they thought it was abandoned, maybe they were just checking. But the prints were too close, too deliberate. They had stood there, just feet from where I slept, listening. Despite the unease crawling in my gut, I convinced myself to stay one more night. I had food left, and I didn't want to pack up everything just because of a maybe. So I spent the day hiking further into the hills, trying to shake off the feeling. The landscape was beautiful. Rolling fields, vineyards stretching far into the distance, and the sound of church bells carrying from the village below. By evening, I felt calmer, almost foolish for being so spooked. That night, I cooked a small meal again and crawled into my tent earlier than before. I read, trying to focus, but my eyes kept flicking to the thin nylon walls, listening for anything unusual. Hours passed quietly. I must have drifted off at some point, because the next time I opened my eyes, it was pitch black, and I heard it again, the footsteps, but this time they didn't circle the tent. They stopped directly in front of it. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like an eternity. My breath caught in my throat, my hand tightening around the knife. Then, a shadow fell across the tent wall. The dim starlight outside made their outline visible against the fabric. A tall figure, broad shoulders, standing unnaturally still. I lay frozen, every nerve screaming. The figure didn't move for several minutes. Then slowly it crouched down. I could see the shape of their head lowering, as if they were peering into the tent despite the fabric blocking their view. I fought every instinct to scream, to bolt, to do anything that would give me away. My chest ached from holding my breath. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the figure stood again. The steps retreated slowly into the woods, fading until all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat. I didn't sleep again. I sat there in silence, gripping the knife until dawn came. When the sun rose, I unzipped the tent and stepped out, my legs weak. This time, the shoe prints weren't just in front of the tent. They were everywhere, circling multiple times, crossing back and forth like the person had paced around for hours. That was enough for me. I packed everything as fast as I could, stuffing gear into my bag with shaking hands. My back felt prickled the entire time, as though eyes were watching me from the trees. By the time I slung the pack over my shoulder and started down the trail toward the village, I was sweating despite the cool morning air. I didn't see anyone on the way back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made me whip my head around. It wasn't until I reached the village road, with houses in sight and the sound of cars passing, that I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. I never camped in that spot again. In fact, after that, I stopped wild camping entirely in France. I stuck to official campsites, ones with other people nearby. The idea of being alone in the woods had seemed peaceful at first, but I learned how quickly peace could turn into something else when you realized you weren't actually alone. Years later, I still think about those nights. I'll never know who that man was or what he wanted. Maybe it was just some drifter, curious about a stranger's tent. Maybe it was someone with worse intentions. What I do know is this: he knew I was there, and he chose to stand just outside, watching, listening, moving around my tent in the middle of the night. That was enough. I was 31 years old the first time I camped deep in the Amazon. It was 2018, and I had joined a small expedition group, though on that particular night I was on my own. The others had set up camp about half a mile away because the ground near them had been better drained, but I had chosen a spot closer to the river's edge. It wasn't a smart decision, though it felt right at the time. I wanted the sound of the water nearby, thinking it would calm me to sleep. By evening, the jungle air had grown heavy and wet, as if it was pressing down on my chest. The heat didn't let up, not even after the sun fell. The clouds had already gathered when I set up my tent. They were thick, dark, and low, carrying the smell of rain that clung to everything. I built a small fire before the storm came in, cooking a bit of dried meat I had packed. The flames hissed as the first drops fell, and before long the rain hammered the ground so hard I had to retreat into my tent. Inside, the noise was deafening. The rain slapped against the fabric so loudly it drowned out nearly every other sound. My flashlight beam made the walls glow pale yellow as the water dripped down, small leaks forming near the seams. The air grew hot and humid, and the smell of damp earth filled the tent. I tried to distract myself by writing notes in my small journal, but the constant battering of rain made it impossible to focus. At first, I thought the storm was the worst of it, but I learned quickly that in the Amazon, storms pull other things out with them. The ground around my tent turned soft, sucking at the stakes and letting the fabric shift. Each gust of wind rattled the frame, and I could feel the edges giving way. I pressed my palms to the floor and felt it sponge beneath me. The water was seeping through the soil, turning the ground into something alive, shifting, sucking at anything that pressed into it. Couldn't sleep, so I lay listening. Between the sheets of rain, there were other noises. Branches cracking, heavy drops falling from leaves, distant splashes in the river. Then I heard something closer, a rustling sound, steady, moving through the wet leaves just beyond my tent. It wasn't the random fall of rain. It had rhythm like footsteps. I turned off my flashlight and sat in complete darkness. My heart thudded so hard I thought it would give me away. I held still, straining my ears, but the rain made it nearly impossible to separate one sound from another. Still, the rustling grew louder. Whatever it was circling, slow and deliberate. I had no weapon besides a long hunting knife strapped to my belt. I reached for it, gripping the handle until my knuckles hurt. My breathing grew shallow. Then the sound stopped. I told myself it was just some animal foraging, maybe a tapir or a capybara pushed close to camp by the storm. That thought gave me a moment of relief, but the relief didn't last. Something heavy slammed against the side of the tent. The thin fabric caved inward, and I could see the shape of it pressed against the wall, rounded, broad, low to the ground. My body froze. The sound of sniffing filled the air, wet and deep, snorts that shook the fabric inches from my face. I knew then it wasn't some harmless creature. It was bigger, a jaguar maybe, or something even larger. The animal paced slowly, brushing the tent with its body, dragging along the nylon, circling again. I could feel the pressure of its weight through the ground, the soft thud of its paws over the wet earth. The rain poured harder, almost drowning the sounds, but I could still make out the low growl that came when it stopped moving. My skin prickled all over, every instinct in me screaming not to move. The animal pressed its weight against the tent again, testing it. The stakes pulled free from the soaked ground. The wall bowed, threatening to collapse. I gripped my knife tighter and slid it free, ready for whatever came through. My mind was racing. Should I run into the rain and hope it lost interest? Or should I stay and hope the tent didn't give way? Neither felt survivable. Minutes dragged like hours. The animal lingered, circling again and again, brushing the tent, growling low. Then, as suddenly as it came, it moved away. The sound of footsteps splashing into the mud grew fainter. I sat frozen in the dark, knife clutched to my chest, listening as the jungle swallowed the noise. But the danger wasn't gone. The rainwater had risen around me, creeping into the floor of the tent. My sleeping bag was soaked through, and every shift I made pulled me deeper into the soft mud beneath. I knew I couldn't stay there. If the animal came back, or if the ground gave way, I'd be trapped. I stuffed my gear back into my pack in the dark, every movement slow, careful not to make noise. Then I unzipped the tent and slipped into the rain. The world outside was pitch black, except for the white flashes of lightning that lit the jungle in quick, blinding bursts. Each flash showed me the river, swollen and fast, tearing at the banks. The mud sucked at my boots as I moved, heavy and slippery. The rain beat so hard it stung my skin. I kept the knife in one hand and my pack strapped to my back, forcing myself step by step toward higher ground, away from the river's edge. Every sound set my nerves on fire. The snap of a branch, the splash of something moving in the undergrowth. My body was shivering from fear and exhaustion, but the heat kept sweat pouring down my face. I pushed forward, slipping more than once, nearly losing my footing in the dark. Finally, after what felt like hours, I spotted a faint glow through the trees. It was the other camp. The rest of the group had their fire burning low under a tarp, a small light in the endless dark. Relief washed over me so strong I almost collapsed. I dragged myself into camp, soaked to the bone, mud caked to my legs, knife still gripped tight in my hand. The others looked at me with wide eyes, but I didn't say a word. I just dropped my pack, sat down by the fire, and let the heat of the flames reach my shaking body. That night in the Amazon taught me a lesson I'll never forget. The jungle doesn't need myths or monsters to terrify you. Its power is real, its dangers alive and breathing. The rain, the river, the predators, the ground itself. They all wait for you to make a mistake. I had gone in thinking I wanted solitude, to feel the raw beauty of the place up close. But out there, alone in the storm with a predator circling me, I realized how fragile I really was. The jungle didn't care who I was, how prepared I thought I'd been, or what I believed about myself. It only tested me, and for one long, endless night, I barely passed. When the sun rose the next morning, the rain eased, and the jungle glistened fresh and green. But every time I think back to that night, I don't remember the beauty. I remember the sound of heavy breathing against the thin wall of my tent, and how close I came to disappearing into the storm forever. I still remember the trip like it was carved into my bones. It was the summer of 2013, and I had just turned 27. I lived in Ohio at the time, working long weeks in a machine shop, and I wanted a break from the constant noise of drills and steel presses. A friend had mentioned years ago that the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania had some of the quietest, most untouched stretches of woods you could find without going out west. I wanted that silence. So, I loaded my old Chevy with a tent, a sleeping bag, my cooler, and enough gear to stay out there for 4 or 5 nights. I told no one exactly where I was going, just that I was going camping. At the time, it felt freeing. Looking back, it was probably the first mistake I made. By the second day, I had hiked deeper than I planned. The trails were mostly clear, but I got stubborn about finding my own spot. I wanted to be away from other people, far from the sound of trucks, radios, or kids shouting. I ended up following a deer path that sloped down toward a slow creek, and after about half an hour, I found a flat patch under a cluster of tall maples. The ground was soft with leaves, and the creek water was cold enough to sting my hands. It felt perfect, hidden. That evening, I pitched my tent, built a small fire with some dry branches, and sat there listening to the forest close in as the light faded. The woods had a way of growing louder at night. Frogs croaking, insects buzzing, branches snapping in the distance. I felt good, though. That was the point of coming out here. The first night was uneventful. I woke once or twice to the sound of coyotes yipping far off, but that was expected. In the morning, I boiled water for instant coffee, packed a small bag, and decided to hike upstream. The creek wound through steep embankments, and after a while I came across what looked like an old hunting blind. Wooden planks half-rotted, leaning at an angle against a tree. It didn't look like it had been touched in years. I snapped a picture on my phone, then moved on. The air smelled damp, heavy with moss and wet earth. It was on the way back that I noticed something strange. Near my campsite, maybe 50 yards through the trees, there was a cluster of rocks stacked in a way that didn't seem natural. 3 flat stones balanced on top of one another. Not huge, but just enough to catch my eye. I didn't think much of it. People make cairns all the time when hiking. I figured some backpacker had been through here before me. That night, though, I woke around 2 in the morning. At first, I thought it was the wind. The nylon walls of the tent rippled softly, but the air was still. Then I heard it, slow, deliberate footsteps moving through leaves. Not an animal scurrying, not the quick light sound of a deer, but heavy, steady, like someone walking and trying not to be heard. My chest tightened. I lay completely still, listening. The steps circled once, maybe 20 feet away, then faded. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't move. I just lay there, heart hammering, until exhaustion pulled me under again. In the daylight, I told myself it had to have been an animal. Maybe a black bear. Maybe I had imagined it half asleep. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I checked around the campsite. No tracks I could recognize, no trash disturbed. But when I walked to where I thought the sound had come from, I noticed something that froze me in place. Another rock pile, smaller this time, only 2 stones stacked neatly on top of a stump. I left it alone, packed my gear into the tent, went fishing for most of the day, tried to ignore it. By evening, I convinced myself it was coincidence. Stones fall, people camp, no reason to panic. The fire felt comforting that night, the orange light pushing back the shadows. I remember staring into it for hours, trying not to look into the woods. It was the 3rd night when things got worse. Around midnight, I woke to the same sound, footsteps, but closer this time. My mouth went dry. I held my breath and listened. The steps crunched softly around the tent, slow, deliberate, circling. At one point, something brushed against the tent wall, just lightly, enough to make the nylon flex inward. My whole body went rigid. I wanted to call out, but my throat locked up. Minutes dragged by. Eventually, the sound faded again, deeper into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. As soon as the sun rose, I packed everything. I decided I was cutting the trip short. Whatever peace I'd wanted wasn't worth this crawling unease that had taken root in me. As I rolled up the tent, though, I saw something that made my stomach turn. Directly behind where the tent had stood, arranged in a clean line, were 5 small piles of rocks, each one no taller than my ankle, spaced evenly apart, like someone had stood there in the night building them while I slept inches away. I left the campsite in a rush, barely stopping to strap down my pack. I didn't even bother dousing the fire completely, just kicked dirt over it and started moving. I followed the creek downstream, hoping it would take me closer to the road. My hands shook as I walked. Every snapped twig behind me made me spin around. Hours later, I finally hit a marked trail again. Relief washed over me when I saw the painted blazes on the trees, proof that I was back where people hiked. But before I could feel fully safe, I noticed one last thing that has never left me. Right at the edge of the trail, where I stepped out from the deer path, sat another rock stack. Taller this time, maybe knee-high, balanced perfectly in the center of the trail as if waiting for me. That was the moment I stopped doubting myself. Whoever or whatever had been in those woods knew I was there. They had watched me. They had come close enough to touch my tent while I slept. And they had wanted me to know it. I didn't stop walking until I reached my car. I drove 7 hours back home in one stretch, not even pulling over for food. When I finally unlocked my apartment door, I felt like I had stepped into another world. The walls, the hum of the fridge, the distant sound of traffic. It was all proof I was back among people. But for weeks after, I barely slept. Every creak of the building, every neighbor's step in the hall made my chest seize. I never told anyone the full story. I just said the trip was cut short, that the weather turned bad. But deep down, I know what I experienced. There was someone out there, hidden in those woods, who didn't want me there. Not a ghost, not a monster, just someone. A stranger who enjoyed being unseen, who built those rock piles as a message, a warning, maybe even a game. I still go camping sometimes, but never alone, and never without telling someone exactly where I'm going. And I will never set foot in the Allegheny Forest again. Some places aren't meant for solitude. Some silences aren't natural. Out there, in the dark, I learned that the scariest thing isn't what you can't explain. It's what you can. I was 27 in the fall of 2014 when I decided to take a solo hunting trip up in the northern woods of Montana. I'd been hunting since I was a kid, always tagging along with my uncle and cousins, and by then I was confident enough to go alone. I had an old Ford truck, a battered canvas tent I'd used for years, a .308 rifle with a scope, and all the gear I thought I'd need. I wanted to be away from people for a few days, breathe in cold, clean air, and maybe bring back some venison. The weather was shifting into that raw, late October chill. The kind where the mornings cut your skin with frost and the evenings smell like wet pine and old leaves. The drive up the gravel roads was bumpy, my truck shaking over every rut, but I liked that sense of being far from pavement. I stopped by a small gas station in town earlier to grab extra jerky, water, and batteries. The old man running the place just glanced at my gear and said nothing. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing deep in the timber. The pines crowded around it like a dark wall, tall and sharp against the gray sky. I set up camp near a narrow creek, staking the tent between two firs. I gathered some dead branches and got a small fire going while the sun slipped lower. The sound of the creek was steady, almost calming, and I thought it would help me sleep. The first evening I just stayed near camp, warming a can of chili on the fire. The woods felt different than they used to when I was younger. More silent. The silence pressed in, broken only by the distant crack of a branch now and then. I tried not to think too much of it and laid out my sleeping bag once the fire burned down. The first night passed slow. I kept waking up at odd hours. Every time I woke, I thought I heard something faint, like footsteps crunching leaves, pausing, then fading. But I told myself it was just deer or maybe wind. Still, I didn't fall into deep sleep. By dawn, I was restless but ready to hunt. That morning, I hiked uphill into the timber, rifle slung over my shoulder. The cold air made every breath sting. I moved slow, scanning ridges, listening for movement. A few times I thought I caught sight of a deer's flank, but it turned out to be shadow. After hours, I finally spotted fresh tracks pressed into soft earth. I followed them deeper, losing track of time. By noon, clouds had rolled in. The woods dimmed, and it felt like late evening already. The tracks wound down into a gulch thick with brush. As I stepped carefully, I froze. Ahead, through a thin screen of branches, I saw movement. I steadied my rifle, thinking it was a buck. But when I cleared the brush, what I saw wasn't an animal. It was a man. He was crouched low, maybe 30 yards away, half hidden by branches. He wasn't wearing blaze orange or camo like most hunters, just a faded gray hoodie and dark pants. He was still head tilted toward the ground, like he was studying something. I held back, not wanting to spook him, but something in me felt uneasy. He didn't look up, didn't move, just crouched like he had all the time in the world. I stood there for maybe a minute, unsure what to do. Then, without warning, he turned his head slightly, and I swear his eyes landed right on me. Even from that distance, I felt it. My stomach dropped. He didn't say anything, didn't move fast. He just straightened up slowly and started walking into the trees without a word. No wave, no nod, nothing. I stayed frozen until he disappeared into the timber. My hands felt numb even through gloves. I told myself maybe he was just some local out there scouting, but why no gear, no rifle, no acknowledgement? Something about the way he looked at me stuck in my gut. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake it. I kept glancing around as I hunted, feeling watched. By the time I returned to camp, the light was fading. I got a fire going quick, more for comfort than warmth. The crackle and smoke gave me something to focus on. But the trees loomed closer that night, and the silence felt heavier. When I finally crawled into the tent, I left the fire burning down to embers. I laid there listening to the creek, telling myself to relax. Sometime in the dead of night, though, I woke again. This time it wasn't footsteps. It was breathing. Faint, slow, steady breathing outside my tent. I froze in my bag, barely daring to move. My heart slammed in my chest so hard I thought whoever was out there could hear it. I reached quietly for the rifle beside me, the metal cold against my fingers. The breathing continued, no more than a few feet away, then stopped. After what felt like an hour of silence, I heard soft crunches moving away into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I laid there gripping the rifle until pale gray light crept into the tent. By morning, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up quick, hardly eating anything. But as I folded the tent, I saw it, clear as day, in the damp dirt just outside the flap. A footprint. Not a boot print like mine. A bare footprint. Long, narrow, with toes pressed into the soil. It was angled straight toward the tent, right where I'd heard the breathing. That was it. I threw my gear in the truck, barely lashing it down, and started driving out fast. Every bump and rut made my teeth chatter, but I didn't care. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following on foot. When I finally hit pavement again and saw a few cars on the road, I felt my body let go, trembling all over. I didn't stop until I was back in town, parked under bright lights outside a diner. I sat there, hands gripping the wheel, staring out at people going in and out like nothing had happened. I never went back to that spot. I still hunt, but never alone, and never that deep into the woods. Sometimes I wonder who that man was, or what he wanted, standing outside my tent in the dark. I tell myself it was just some drifter, someone passing through, but the footprint stays burned in my head. A grown man walking barefoot miles into cold Montana timber in late October, watching me sleep. That's the kind of thing you don't forget, no matter how much time passes. I was 27 years old the summer I decided to camp alone for the first time. It was 2016, mid-July, and I had been telling myself for months that I needed a break from work, from the noise of traffic, from screens and constant messages. I packed up my old Ford with a cheap tent, a sleeping bag, a small propane stove, and some basic supplies. I didn't want to go anywhere crowded. I wanted real quiet. I picked a remote spot in Montana, near a patch of woods not far from a winding river I'd only ever seen on maps. It wasn't an official campground, just dirt trails, trees, and endless silence. The air smelled of pine when I arrived in the late afternoon. The sky was heavy with gray, and I could feel the weight of humidity pressing down. I parked the car off to the side of the trail where the grass was already flattened, like someone had used it before me. I walked around until I found a patch of soft earth under a line of tall trees, and I pitched the tent there. It wasn't perfect, but I was tired from driving. As the sun started dipping behind the hills, I boiled some water for instant noodles. Steam rose against the cooling air, and I sat on a folding chair listening to nothing but the rush of the river and an occasional bird cutting across the sky. The longer I sat there, the more I noticed how quiet it actually was. No engines, no voices, no distant highway hum. Just silence that pressed against my ears in a way that almost felt unnatural. When night came, I zipped myself inside the tent. I left the rain fly off so I could see the sky. Stars spread wide and sharp, brighter than I'd ever seen back in the city. I drifted to sleep to the soft trickle of the river. Sometime in the night, I woke up. At first, I thought it was because of the chill. The air had turned sharp and cold. My sleeping bag was pulled tight around my chin. I lay there with my eyes half open, just staring at the shapes of trees above me. Then I realized what had woken me. There was movement outside. It wasn't close at first, more like branches snapping far back in the woods. I froze, listening. My heart picked up. The sound came again, a crack and shuffle, like something heavy pressing through brush. I thought maybe it was a deer, or maybe an elk. But the longer I listened, the more it sounded different. Slower, heavier, almost careful. I sat up in the tent, every muscle tight. My breathing felt too loud. I wanted to grab my flashlight, but I didn't want to make any sudden sound. Then I heard it again, closer this time. The air felt thin in my chest. For what felt like an hour, I sat still, waiting for the sound to fade. Eventually, it did. Silence stretched on, and I told myself I was overreacting. My body relaxed just enough for sleep to pull me under again. When I woke in the morning, the grass outside my tent was pressed flat. Footsteps, not boots, not shoes.
Bora.
Long, narrow impressions leading from the tree line toward the river. I crouched there staring at them, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light or just the way the dirt had dried. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The whole day, I couldn't shake it. I tried fishing by the river, but every few minutes I found myself looking over my shoulder. The woods felt different now, heavier. I moved through camp quickly, keeping busy, but every noise, every bird call or rustle of leaves, shot through me like a warning. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in thick and low. Rain started in thin drops and then turned into a steady pour. I sat inside the tent with the flap zipped up, listening to the water hammering down on nylon. My phone had no signal. My car was a quarter-mile up the trail. I thought about leaving, but it was already too late in the day to drive out of those back roads safely in the dark. The rain eased into night, but the ground outside was soaked. I sat with my flashlight off, wrapped tight in my sleeping bag, listening again. First, nothing, just dripping branches. Then, just like the night before, something moved. This time it was closer, directly behind the tent. I felt the vibrations of soft steps through the wet ground. Slow, deliberate, they circled, My breath caught in my throat as shadows brushed across the thin nylon wall inches from my face. I gripped the handle of the hatchet I had left inside the tent. My hand was sweating around the wood. Whoever it was, or whatever, it didn't say a word. Just walked, steady and patient, around my tent. Once, twice, then silence. I didn't sleep that night. My body stayed rigid, eyes wide open, waiting for the sound to return. Not until the first pale light of dawn spread over the trees. When I finally stepped outside, I saw it again. Prints, bare feet pressed deep into the mud, circling the tent. They were longer than mine, the toes spread wide. The stride was off, like whoever left them dragged slightly with each step. My chest tightened so hard I thought I might pass out. I packed fast, stuffing everything into the car without even folding it properly. My hands shook as I tried to shove wet fabric into the trunk. I glanced back at the tree line again and again, expecting to see someone watching. But there was nothing, just the trees. Driving out on the narrow dirt road, every shadow looked alive. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel. I didn't breathe normally until the road opened onto pavement hours later, where other cars moved in both directions. People, life, safety. I never went back to that place. Even now, years later, I still see those prints when I close my eyes. Whoever it was, they weren't lost. They weren't curious. They knew I was there, and they wanted me to know they were there too. That's what unsettles me the most. Not that I was watched, but that they didn't take anything, didn't try to talk, didn't even leave a trace of who they were. They just circled my tent in the night, close enough for me to hear every step, and left. It was the kind of silence that doesn't fade, the kind that follows you long after you've left the woods. I was 24 when it happened, back in 2012. I had taken a week off work and wanted to get away from the noise of the city. I grew up in Colorado, but that summer I decided to drive south, down near the border of New Mexico, where the land felt emptier, where the desert stretched further than my eyes could see. I'd read about some trails near Shiprock that weren't crowded, places where you could camp alone and feel like you were the last person left on Earth. That sounded perfect to me at the time. I left early in the morning and drove for hours, the roads becoming smaller and lonelier the further I went. The sky out there was huge, no buildings, no trees tall enough to block it, just wide open blue. By the time I parked my truck at the dirt pull-off near the start of the trail, the sun was dipping low, spilling red light across the dry ground. I should have felt nervous being alone so far from town, but instead I felt free. I strapped my pack, checked my gear, and walked for nearly an hour before I picked my spot. It was a flat stretch with a few scattered juniper bushes, some rocks, and a good view of the hills in the distance. I pitched my tent, got a small fire going, and sat there with a can of chili heating up in the flames. The air was dry and sharp, and the silence was heavier than I'd expected. No cars, no voices, not even the hum of power lines. Just wind sliding across the dirt. The first strange thing happened as the light faded. I was crouched near the fire, stirring my food, when I heard footsteps behind me. They were slow and uneven, crunching in the dirt. I froze. My mind went straight to the obvious, maybe another hiker, maybe a rancher passing through. I turned quick, expecting to see someone walking up, but there was nothing. Just the firelight flickering over empty ground. I stood up, scanning the shadows. The sound had been so clear, like boots dragging across gravel, but the desert was wide open. If anyone had been there, I would have seen them. My stomach felt tight, but I forced myself to shake it off. Sound carries weird out there, I told myself. Could have been an animal moving around. I ate, cleaned up, and zipped into my tent once the fire burned down. The ground was hard and uncomfortable, but I was tired. For a while, all I could hear was the wind pressing against the nylon walls. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember was waking up in the middle of the night, heart pounding. There was a sound outside. At first I thought it was coyotes, but it wasn't yipping or howling. It was breathing, slow, heavy breaths, right outside my tent. I lay perfectly still, my chest tight, listening. I could hear the weight of it shift, like something big moving its feet just inches from me. My hand slid to the knife I kept near my sleeping bag. The breaths dragged out, deep and wet, not like a dog panting, not like a person either. I held my breath until my lungs hurt. Eventually the sound moved away, slow, deliberate, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning came, I crawled out and looked around. The dirt was scattered with prints. Not clear shoe prints, not clear paw prints either. They were long, misshapen, almost like a barefoot impression but stretched out, uneven. I told myself it had to be erosion or just bad ground, but I knew what I'd heard. I should have packed up and left right then, but stubbornness kept me there. I'd driven all this way, and I didn't want to admit I was scared. I convinced myself it was just wildlife. Maybe a stray dog, maybe even a cow wandering from a ranch. The second night was worse. I kept the fire going as long as I could, the flames pushing back the dark. I sat up with my back to the tent, my flashlight in my lap. The desert cooled fast, and soon I was shivering, the cold biting through my jacket. It started with a whistle, high-pitched, off-key, drifting across the dark. My head snapped up. It wasn't close, but it was clear, too clear. The sound echoed like it had been made just for me to hear. My skin crawled, every hair on my arm standing up. Then came the movement. Something walked at the edge of the firelight, just outside where I could see. I caught a glimpse of it once, just for a second. Tall, too tall, shoulders hunched forward, limbs awkward, like it didn't know how to use its own body. It circled me. I could hear the dirt crunch, the brush shift. Every few minutes it would stop, and the silence pressed down so hard I thought my ears would burst. Then, a scraping sound, like nails dragging against stone. I sat there until the fire burned low, my hands shaking, gripping the flashlight so tight my knuckles hurt. When I finally crawled into my tent, I didn't even bother with the zipper. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it. Sometime in the dead of night, I heard it again. This time it was my name. It came broken, twisted, like someone trying to copy a voice they'd only heard once. My name, drawn out in the dark, over and over, until I pressed my hands against my ears. I didn't answer. I didn't move. When the first light hit the horizon, I couldn't stand it anymore. I packed fast, shoving everything into my bag without caring how. My hands shook so bad I dropped my gear twice. I doused the fire, slung my pack, and started back toward the truck without eating, without resting, just walking as fast as I could. Halfway back, I saw it again. It was standing out on a ridge, maybe 100 yards off, perfectly still. Even from that distance, I could see its arms hanging too long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. I didn't stop to look. I didn't want to know if it was watching me. The last mile felt endless. My throat was dry, my legs heavy, but the thought of stopping made my stomach twist. When I finally saw the truck through the heat shimmer, I nearly cried. I threw my pack in the back, jumped inside, and locked the doors. As I turned the key, I looked up at the rearview mirror. There was nothing behind me, just the empty desert stretching forever. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. I drove the entire way back to Colorado without stopping, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. To this day, I don't camp alone anymore. I tell people it's because I got sick of the cold ground and bad sleep, but the truth is, it's because of that night. Because whatever was out there wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person either. and I know it's still out there, waiting in the empty places where the silence is too deep and the dark feels too close. That's why I don't go back. I had never been the type to do much camping, but in the summer of 2014, I decided to give it a real try. I'd been working long weeks, stuck behind screens and walls, and I wanted to remind myself what quiet really felt like. A coworker had mentioned a place near Debity, out by a wooded area that not many people bothered with anymore. Supposedly, it was good for fishing and quiet enough that you wouldn't be disturbed. That was exactly what I was looking for. I left early on a Friday afternoon, packed light, just a tent, a sleeping bag, food, and some basic gear. My car was old but steady, and the drive out was calm. The weather had been humid all week, and as I rolled the windows down, the warm air felt heavy, like it was carrying something with it. The closer I got to the forest line, the fewer houses I saw. After a while, it was only farmland, broken fences, and then the thick green line of trees rising against the sky. I parked where the gravel road ended, a small turnout with enough space for maybe 2 cars. Mine was the only one there. I shouldered my pack and started along a trail that looked more like it hadn't been used in months. Weeds brushed my legs, and I could hear the insects buzzing close to my ears. It took maybe 30 minutes to find a flat space near the river, just big enough to set up camp. The water moved slow, dark and quiet, and the trees leaned so far over it that the light barely broke through. Setting up was simple. Tent, sleeping bag, small fire pit circled with rocks I pulled together. I cooked a little food, sat by the river and listened. It was what I'd hoped for, silent in a way that cities never are. Just bugs, the occasional plop of water, and the creak of trees in the wind. I sat there until the sky turned a dull gray, then darker, until the woods felt like they had shut me in completely. I laid in my tent that night, the ground firm under the thin padding of my sleeping bag. Sleep came slow. Every sound outside pressed into my ears. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching, faint splashes in the river. I told myself it was raccoons, deer, maybe even a fox nosing around. Still, every time something brushed too close, I froze, listening harder, waiting for it to move on. At some point, I finally drifted off. The second night was when things turned. The day had passed slow. I'd walked a bit deeper into the woods, found the remains of an old fire pit half buried under leaves, and some trash that looked like it had been there for years. Beer cans rusted through, a torn tarp, the kind of stuff that told me someone else had once tried to make this spot home. I moved on, not wanting to disturb it. The air felt thicker that day, clouds heavy above me, and the river looked darker, like the bottom had sunk deeper overnight. That evening, I built my fire bigger. Flames licked higher, and I fed them just to keep them alive. I didn't like the silence as much anymore. Felt less like peace and more like waiting. When the light finally drained from the sky, I sat by the fire, eating slowly, trying to make it last. I caught myself glancing back at the tree line over and over, as though I'd see someone standing there. I told myself I was being dramatic, just not used to the quiet. But then I heard it, a crack. Not sharp, not like a branch breaking under an animal. This was heavier, deliberate. I froze. My food sat on my knee, forgotten. I kept my eyes on the dark shapes between the trees, trying not to blink. For a moment, nothing. Then another step, slow, steady, like a boot pressing into the ground. My chest tightened. I leaned closer to the fire, feeding it more wood, making the light flare out further. Nothing moved at the edge of it. The forest just watched back, empty. But I knew what I heard. That was no deer. I didn't sleep much that night. I laid in the tent, staring at the thin nylon walls, hearing things that might not have been there at all. A shuffle here, a drag there. Sometimes silence was worse because in silence you start imagining. I kept gripping the little knife I'd packed, my palms sweating against the handle. When dawn finally lit the sky, I felt like I hadn't closed my eyes once. I thought about packing up and leaving. Part of me screamed to do it, but pride kept me there. I told myself I'd camp the weekend, and I didn't want to quit because of shadows and sounds. So I stayed. I wish I hadn't. That afternoon, I wandered upriver. The trail there was faint, but I followed it until I reached a clearing. The grass was pressed down in a way that didn't look natural. Patches of dirt had been scuffed, not by animals, but by shoes. More than one pair. I crouched, touching the earth, noticing the pattern of soles. Some large, some small. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. Weeks, maybe days. I stood up fast, suddenly aware of how quiet it was. No birds, no insects. Just stillness pressing against me. I backed out of the clearing, forcing myself to walk slow even though everything in me wanted to run. By the time the sun dropped, I was sitting close to the fire again, every muscle wound tight. My eyes scanned the dark trees, the reflection of the flames flickering in the water. I tried to eat but couldn't swallow much. My ears strained for every sound. Then I heard it again. Not one step this time, but several. Slow, almost dragging. The crack of branches under weight. I gripped my knife so hard my hand ached. The fire popped, throwing sparks, and for a second I thought I saw a shape beyond the flames. Tall, unmoving, watching. My breath caught. I blinked, and it was gone, swallowed by the dark. That was enough. I didn't care about pride anymore. I grabbed my pack, shoved what I could inside, and kicked dirt over the fire until it smothered out. The night felt heavier without it. I zipped the tent half shut just to make it look occupied, then slung my pack on and started walking fast toward where I'd parked. The trail seemed longer in the dark. Every crunch of my boots sounded like thunder. I kept glancing back, certain I'd see someone following, but all I saw was blackness layered on blackness. My chest hurt from holding my breath too much. When I finally broke out of the tree line and saw my car, relief almost made me collapse. I fumbled the keys, got the door open, and slid inside. I locked the doors immediately, hands shaking. That's when I noticed. On the far side of the turnout, near the tree line, there was a pile of ashes. Fire pit, newer than the old one I'd found. Bits of charred wood, faint smoke curling up like it had been used not long ago. And near it, 2 folding chairs still open, facing the trees. They hadn't been there when I arrived. I didn't wait. I turned the key, floored the gas, and didn't look back. My headlights carved through the dark, the gravel spitting behind me. I drove until I hit paved road, then faster still, not stopping until I saw the glow of the town ahead. I never went back to Debity after that. It's been years, and I still wonder who was out there. Maybe hunters, maybe squatters, maybe something else. But I know this. Someone was in those woods with me, watching, waiting. And if I had stayed one more night, I don't think I'd be here to write this now. I remember that trip like it was burned into my head. Every smell, every sound, every little detail. It was the summer of 2012, hot during the day but cooler at night. My mom and dad, both retired cops, had decided we should go on a camping trip for a few days. They had spent decades in the city working long shifts, chasing down criminals, and dealing with all the ugliness that came with the job. Retirement had slowed them down, but it hadn't softened them. They were both in their late 50s, strong for their age, and still carried that way of moving and looking around that told you they never stopped paying attention. We went out to the northern woods of Michigan, near a lake where few people camped. It wasn't a big organized campground, more like a patch of public land you had to hike into with your gear. That's exactly what my dad wanted. Quiet, no other people, No noise except the wind in the trees and the water slapping against the shore. We brought a big tent, sleeping bags, lanterns, and enough food to last almost a week. The first day felt perfect. The air smelled of pine, the dirt trail crunched under our boots, and the lake looked still and clean like a sheet of dark glass. My dad picked a spot a little higher up from the shoreline, on a flat piece of ground where the trees opened just enough for sunlight to reach through. By the time we got the tent up, a fire pit built, and our stuff arranged, it felt like we were in a little private world. That first night went smooth. The fire burned bright, crickets sang, and I fell asleep to the sound of loons calling across the water. But the second night was different. The change started small. As the sun dipped down, I noticed how quiet the woods became. Usually you hear insects, frogs, maybe a branch snap in the distance. But it got so still that even the sound of the fire crackling felt too loud. My mom had her arms crossed, eyes scanning the dark like she was back on patrol. My dad was sharpening a knife with a steady rhythm, the scrape of metal against stone cutting through the silence. I laid in the tent that night, staring at the fabric ceiling, listening. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, not an animal. I know the difference between a deer stepping lightly and a human pacing. These were heavy, uneven steps, coming from the trees behind our camp. I held my breath, waiting for my parents to react. Seconds later, the tent zipper pulled up and my dad crawled in. His face looked calm, but his eyes told me he'd heard it too. He laid there awake for hours. The next morning, I noticed boot prints in the dirt, pressed deep near the tree line. Not ours. Too big to be my mom's or mine, and the tread was different than my dad's hiking boots. My dad studied them carefully, crouched low, fingers brushing the edges. He didn't say anything, but he didn't need to. I could see his jaw tighten. The day dragged on. We went fishing, tried to relax, but that feeling hung over everything. By evening, I kept catching my mom glancing over her shoulder, checking the tree lean as she gathered firewood. My dad set the hatchet within arm's reach at all times. That night, it got worse. Sometime past midnight, I woke up to the faint glow of the fire dying outside. Then I heard breathing. Not mine, not my parents', but faint, just outside the tent. Slow and heavy, like someone standing still, waiting. My heart hammered in my chest. I wanted to scream, but I forced myself to stay quiet. Then came the sound of fabric shifting, our cooler outside being moved. My dad was already awake. I heard the quiet click of him unzipping the tent. He slipped out fast and silent, like muscle memory from years on the force. A second later came the harsh snap of branches and the pounding of footsteps tearing into the woods. Someone had been there, close enough to touch our stuff. My dad chased after, but he came back alone. His shirt clung to his chest with sweat, and his hands were shaking from adrenaline, not fear. The next morning we found the cooler a few yards away, flipped open, food scattered. Not taken, just dumped. Like whoever it was wanted us to know they'd been there. My mom muttered under her breath as she cleaned up, her movements quick and sharp. They didn't argue about it, didn't debate what to do. They just started quietly preparing like people who'd done it before. My dad packed up our gear in a way that left only the bare minimum out. Tent, sleeping bags, firewood. My mom checked every angle of the campsite, like she was mapping out sight lines. That third night, I don't think any of us really slept. My parents sat by the fire, backs to each other, watching the woods. I dozed in and out until a sound snapped me fully awake. It was faint at first, like a twig breaking, then more deliberate, crunching footsteps circling the camp. My dad stood, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other. He swung the beam across the trees, and for just a second, I saw it. A man, tall and broad, standing between two pines, staring straight at us. His clothes looked dark, maybe a hoodie, maybe just a jacket, but I'll never forget the way his face caught the light, expressionless, like he wasn't surprised we'd seen him. The light hit his eyes, and he turned without a word, melting back into the black trees. My mom grabbed the hatchet, ready to move, but my dad shook his head. They didn't chase him this time. They just stood there, waiting, while the night stretched on like it would never end. By morning, we were gone. My dad packed up so fast I could barely keep up. We hiked back to the trailhead without stopping for breakfast, barely talking, every noise in the forest making us tense. When we finally reached the car, my dad locked the doors the moment we were inside. We drove in silence until we hit the highway. That's when my mom finally let out a long breath, like she'd been holding it in for days. They never called the police, never made a report, even though they had been cops most of their lives. I asked them later why, and my dad just said some things aren't worth leaving on paper. What stuck with me the most wasn't just the man himself, but the way my parents reacted. I'd always thought of them as unshakable, people who had seen it all and done it all. But out there, in those woods, with no backup and no radio, I saw them scared. Not panicking, not broken, but scared enough to know we needed to leave. Years have passed since then, but I still think about that man sometimes. About how he stood there in silence, watching us in the firelight. He didn't want food. He didn't try to rob us. He just wanted us to know he was there, that the woods weren't as empty as we thought. And that thought, more than anything, is what has kept me from camping in the deep woods ever since. I was 27 years old when I decided to take a solo camping trip through the French countryside in the summer of 2014. I had been traveling around Europe with a backpack, mostly sticking to hostels and cheap ghost houses, but I wanted a break from the noise of the cities and the constant shuffle of other travelers. I bought a small tent, a sleeping bag, and some basic supplies in Lyon, then took a bus south into the rural parts of the Rhône-Alpes region. The air was warm during the day, but by late evening, the hills cooled fast. I set up camp in a clearing about a mile away from a small dirt road. I had seen only a handful of farmhouses scattered miles apart. It was peaceful. The smell of grass and damp earth after a recent rain carried through the air, and I remember thinking it was exactly what I wanted. Quiet and a little bit of isolation. The first night was uneventful. I cooked pasta on my small camp stove, wrote in my journal under the light of a headlamp, and fell asleep with the sound of crickets and a soft breeze moving through the trees. The second day, I hiked along the hills and small streams, stopping to take pictures of old stone walls and fields of sunflowers. When I returned to my tent late that afternoon, everything seemed exactly as I had left it. That evening, though, while gathering wood for a small fire, I felt something that unsettled me. It was just a quick moment, but I had the sense someone was watching. The trees were thick, and the shadows deepened quickly as the sun sank lower, so I told myself I was only imagining things. Still, the feeling stuck. I cooked again, ate, and tried to shake it off. Around 10 p.m., I zipped myself into my tent. The night was dark, almost moonless, and even with the fire burned down to glowing embers, the woods felt endless. I laid down with my sleeping bag pulled to my chin, scrolling through a map I had saved on my phone. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a noise. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. A snapping twig, then another. First, I thought it might just be a deer moving through the brush, but it didn't sound like an animal wandering. The steps had rhythm, slow, deliberate, with pauses in between, as if whoever or whatever it was stopped to listen. I held my breath. I didn't move. The sound drew closer, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. Then it stopped. I laid in the dark, every muscle in my body stiff, straining to hear. The silence was heavy, too heavy, and I swore I could hear someone's breathing out there. Minutes passed, though it felt like an hour. My heart pounded so hard I was sure it would give me away. Finally, I heard the sound again, but this time it moved back toward the trees. Fainter, then gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I unzipped the tent cautiously and looked around. The clearing was still, the grass wet with dew, the air cool. I convinced myself again it was nothing. A deer, a boar, maybe even the wind moving branches that only sounded like footsteps. But when I stepped toward the edge of the clearing, I noticed the ground. There were prints. Not boots, not shoes, bare feet. Large, wide, and pressed into the mud in places. That rattled me more than I wanted to admit. Who walked barefoot in the woods in the middle of the night? The nearest village I had seen was at least 6 miles away. My first thought was maybe it was some local farmer or a hunter, but the strangeness of it gnawed at me. I packed up my bag that day, thinking maybe I'd head toward the road and hitch back into town. But as I sat there, trying to decide, the quiet and sunlight made me second-guess myself. By noon, I had calmed down, telling myself I was just being paranoid. That night, though, my mistake became clear. I built another small fire and tried to eat, but my appetite was gone. The woods seemed too quiet. Around 11 p.m., I put the fire out completely and climbed into my tent, leaving my boots just outside. I thought about keeping a flashlight in my hand, but I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I lay awake for hours listening. Around 2 a.m., I heard the steps again. Same slow pace, same pauses. This time, I didn't freeze. I shifted carefully, reaching for my backpack where I kept a small folding knife. The sound grew closer. 10 feet. 5. I held my breath. Then I saw the shadow. A figure moved across the faint outline of the tent wall, tall and thin, stopping right beside where I lay. I could see the shape of a head tilting like he was listening. He didn't move for nearly a full minute, just stood there. My chest felt like it was going to cave in. I wanted to run, but I knew if I unzipped the tent, I'd give myself away. So I stayed still, gripping the knife so hard my hand hurt. After what felt like forever, the figure moved again. I heard the sound of my boots outside being nudged, maybe picked up, then dropped softly. The steps circled the tent, slow, careful. My throat was dry, my whole body locked in place. Then, just as suddenly as he came, the steps faded. I didn't wait for morning this time. As soon as I was sure he was gone, I packed everything inside the tent as quietly as I could. I didn't even bother folding things properly. By 4 a.m., I had my backpack on and my tent stuffed away, and I started walking fast toward the dirt road with only my headlamp dimmed low. The hike back was brutal. Every sound behind me made me spin around, but I saw nothing. By the time I reached the road, the sun was just coming up, and the world looked different, bright, safe almost. I stuck my thumb out, and within half an hour a farmer in a beat-up truck stopped and gave me a ride to town. When I got to the bus station, I finally looked down at my boots. They were damp from the grass and dirt, but one of them had a long, thin scratch across the leather that hadn't been there before, almost like someone had dragged a nail or knife across it. That was enough for me. I caught the first bus back toward Lyon and didn't camp again the rest of that trip. I don't know who that man was, or why he was out there barefoot in the middle of the night, but I know for certain it wasn't my imagination. I can still see that shadow on the tent wall, too tall, too close, too human. Even now, years later, when I think about camping alone, that night in France comes back sharp and clear. The sound of careful steps in the dark, the weight of silence, and the certainty that someone was out there, watching me while I pretended to sleep. That was the last time I ever camped alone. I was 26 when I decided to take a week off work and go camping by myself. It was the summer of 2011. and I had been feeling like my life was stuck in a loop of office shifts, traffic, and small apartments. I lived in Ohio at the time, and I picked a spot about 3 hours south in Wayne National Forest. I had gone there a couple times with friends years back, but this time I wanted to go alone. It sounded peaceful in my head. No phones, no people, just quiet woods and fresh air. The first day went exactly how I imagined. I parked my car at a small pull-off spot, hiked about 2 miles along a trail, and found a clearing not too far from a creek. It was quiet except for the constant buzz of cicadas and the occasional woodpecker hammering away. I set up my tent slowly, double-checking the poles and stakes. I collected firewood, made myself a small fire, and ate a simple dinner of jerky and trail mix. The air was warm but not unbearable, and when the sun dipped behind the trees, everything faded into that deep blue haze that feels heavier in the woods than it does anywhere else. By the time I crawled into my tent, I felt proud of myself. The second day was a mix of hiking and lounging around. I walked along the creek for a while, saw a couple of deer bolt into the brush, and even found what looked like an old stone wall half covered in moss. Probably a piece of farmland or a foundation left over from 100 years ago. When I got back to camp, I sat in my folding chair and just listened to the woods for a while. There's something about hearing nothing man-made for hours that makes you realize how noisy life normally is. That night, though, things felt different. I stayed up a little later by the fire, roasting hot dogs on a stick I'd cut, sipping from a canteen. Around 10, I heard something move in the brush behind me. It wasn't unusual. Animals are always out there, but it was steady, not the quick dash of a rabbit or the flutter of a bird. It was heavier, deliberate, almost like footsteps, though far enough away that I told myself it was a deer. I turned my flashlight in the direction of the sound, and the beam caught only thick trees and undergrowth. The noise stopped as soon as the light swept that way. I stared for a long time, waiting. Nothing. I got into my tent around midnight. The sound didn't come back, but I didn't fall asleep easily. Every small snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me freeze. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, just the adjustment of being alone in the woods. Eventually, I drifted off. On the third morning, I found something that put me on edge. Not 50 feet from my campsite, near a cluster of pines, there was a pile of broken branches stacked in a way that didn't look random. It wasn't a huge pile, just a small teepee-shaped stack leaned up against one of the trees. It looked like someone had gone around and picked sticks, then arranged them purposefully. I stood there staring at it for a while, telling myself maybe it was kids who'd been here before me, or maybe just some hiker messing around. But the thing was, the wood looked fresh. The ends of the branches weren't weathered or gray. They looked snapped within the last day. I tried to shake it off, but it sat in the back of my mind all day. When evening came, I made my fire a little bigger than usual, almost like the flames would keep me safer. I sat closer to it, facing the direction of that stacked wood. The sound came back again, just after dark, slow, measured crunching in the brush. This time, it circled, moving from one side of the camp to another, always just far enough out of sight. I gripped my flashlight tight, ready to shine it, but I didn't. I just listened, my heart thudding against my ribs. The circling went on for maybe 15 minutes. Then it stopped. I stayed up another hour, fire popping and smoke drifting, before crawling into the tent. I barely slept. In the morning, I noticed something new. Across the creek, maybe 100 feet away, I saw a shape carved into the dirt of the bank. It was rough, almost like someone had used a stick to drag lines into the soil. It was a triangle with a circle in the middle. It looked sloppy, but it was big, maybe 3 feet across. I didn't walk over to it. I just stared from where I stood, the hair on my arms rising. That was the moment I started packing in my head. I told myself I'd leave tomorrow, but really I was already planning to go that night. Still, part of me wanted to see if I was just overreacting. That night it rained, a steady drizzle that turned the fire into steam and left the woods smelling like wet leaves. I stayed in my tent with my lantern, listening to the rain on the nylon. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up suddenly, not from a dream, from a sound. Through the rain, I heard it, footsteps, not scattered or rushed, slow, careful, right outside the tent. The steps circled once, then stopped directly behind my tent. I held my breath, staring at the thin fabric in front of me, praying I wouldn't see a shadow. My knife was in my backpack on the other side of the tent. Too far. I didn't move, my ears strained for any sound. After what felt like forever, the steps started again, moving away, fading into the rain and trees. I didn't sleep after that. I sat up with the lantern until dawn, knife clutched in my hand. When the light finally came, I unzipped the tent and stepped out carefully. The rain had made the ground soft, and that's when I saw them. Footprints, clear boot prints, not animal tracks, pressed into the mud all around my campsite. They circled my tent, just like I thought. Whoever it was had been watching me all night. I paket fast. Tent, chair, stove, everything crammed into my bag in under 15 minutes. I didn't even eat. The whole hike back to the car, I kept glancing behind me, certain I would see someone following. I didn't, but I never shook the feeling. When I got to my car, there was one last thing that almost made me drop my keys. Stuck under my windshield wiper was a single branch, fresh, snapped clean at the end, just like the ones in that pile by the pines. I drove the entire way home without stopping, hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't call the police. What would I say? Some stranger put sticks by my campsite and walked around at night? They'd just shrug it off. That was the last time I camped alone. Even now, years later, I can still see the prints in the mud, circling my tent in the rain, as if someone was waiting for me to step outside. I was 28 years old when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the summer of 2016. I had been working in construction for months without a real break, and I thought a few nights alone in the quiet of nature would clear my head. I picked a spot in the northern part of Montana, not far from Flathead National Forest. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing I found after parking my truck at a small pull-off and hiking about half a mile into the woods. I liked it that way, quiet, out of sight, away from the noise of people. I set up my tent near a line of tall pines, with a small stream just 50 yards away. The ground was a little uneven, but I laid out my tarp and sleeping bag, then stacked some firewood I had collected earlier. The first day went smoothly. I hiked around, ate some canned food, and watched the sun sink behind the trees. By the time the stars came out, I felt calm. There was something about being alone that I liked. I didn't have to talk. I didn't have to listen. Just the wind in the trees, the sound of water running, and the crackle of my fire. The second night, things changed. That day had been hotter, and by evening, the air was heavy. I spent most of it walking along animal trails and then came back sweaty and tired. As the sun went down, I noticed the forest was quieter than usual. No bird sounds, no crickets, nothing except the occasional snap of a branch far off. I told myself it was just the heat keeping the animals still. I cooked a little food on the fire and sat on a log, staring into the flames as the woods got darker. Sometime around 10 p.m., while I was getting ready to crawl into my tent, I heard a noise. Not an animal noise, at least not one I could put my finger on. It sounded like something heavy stepping on dry sticks. It came from the tree-line, maybe 30 or 40 feet away. I froze, listening hard. It stopped when I turned my head. I thought maybe it was a deer or even a bear, so I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and shined it toward the sound. The light fell on tree trunks, branches, nothing moving. I told myself not to overthink it and went into the tent. But once I was lying down, I kept hearing it. Slow steps, crunch, pause, crunch. They circled, then faded, then came back again. At one point, I was certain I heard breathing outside the tent. Not animal panting, slower, heavier, like a person. My mouth went dry, and I gripped the handle of the hunting knife I had brought. I wanted to unzip the tent and look, but at the same time, I didn't want to give away that I was awake. I stayed as still as possible, barely breathing, my ears straining. Eventually, the noises stopped, and I must have dozed off from exhaustion. When I woke up, it was early morning, gray light spilling through the fabric of the tent. I unzipped it carefully and stepped outside. That's when I noticed the ground. Around my campsite, in the soft dirt, were footprints. Human footprints. Bare feet bigger than mine pressed deep into the soil. They weren't there the day before. I counted at least 10, circling my tent and leading back toward the trees. My chest felt like it was caving in. Someone had been out there, walking around my camp in the middle of the night, watching me. I thought about leaving right then, but part of me didn't want to admit fear. I told myself maybe it was some local who wandered too far while hiking, maybe drunk or just curious. I stayed another day, though I barely enjoyed it. Every snapping branch put me on edge. I kept the fire going longer than usual, even in the daylight, just so there was always smoke rising above the trees. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Around midnight, the noises started again. The same slow crunch of footsteps, circling the perimeter of my camp. I didn't turn on my flashlight this time. I didn't want to show where I was looking. I just sat upright in my tent, knife in hand, sweating even though the air had cooled. At one point, I swore I saw a shadow pass against the faint glow of the dying fire. It was tall, too tall to be a kid, and it moved slowly like it wasn't worried about being seen. The hours dragged. My legs cramped from sitting tense in the same position. Every time I thought the noises had faded away, they came back, circling again. Sometime near dawn, I finally made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. When the sun came up, I packed everything fast. My hands shook as I rolled up my sleeping bag and yanked the tent stakes from the ground. I didn't even eat breakfast. I shoved everything into my pack and started down the path toward where my truck was parked. That's when I noticed something that made me stop cold. On the trunk of one of the trees near my tent, someone had carved something. At first, I thought it was just scratches from an animal, but when I leaned closer, I saw it was letters. Deep cuts into the bark, spelling out one word, stay. The letters were uneven, jagged, like they were carved with a knife or some sharp rock. I stood there staring at it, my mouth dry again, my skin crawling. Whoever had been walking around my camp in the night had taken the time to carve that into the tree. They wanted me to see it. I didn't wait any longer. I hiked fast, almost running, my pack bouncing against my back. Every sound in the woods made me turn my head, expecting to see someone following. The trail seemed longer than before, the trees pressing in tight on both sides. My heart hammered in my chest until I finally saw the glint of my truck through the trees. I nearly sprinted the last stretch. When I reached the truck, I threw my gear into the bed without bothering to organize it. I climbed in, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment, my breathing ragged. The forest around me was still. No footsteps, no voices, nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I started the engine and drove out of there, gravel kicking up behind me. I didn't look in the mirrors until I was miles away, back on the main road. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there. It wasn't a ghost, it wasn't some monster. It was a person, a real person who walked barefoot through the woods in the middle of the night and carved a message into a tree just feet from where I was sleeping. That thought scares me more than anything else, because people are unpredictable, people are dangerous, and someone out there wanted me to stay, even when every instinct in me told me to run. I never camped alone again after that. I was 24 years old in the fall of 1999 when I decided to go on a solo camping trip in northern Arizona. I had driven out of Phoenix early in the morning with a small pack, a tent, and my old rifle strapped in the back seat of my truck. I wasn't hunting, but I liked to have something for protection. I had done plenty of camping trips before, usually with friends, but this one I wanted to do alone. I told myself it would give me a chance to clear my head and just get away from the city noise for a couple of nights. The weather that morning had been clear, blue skies with the kind of dry air you expect in Arizona, but by the time I got near the mountains, the clouds had started rolling in. The forecast hadn't called for storms, but in that part of the state, the weather changes fast. I thought nothing of it at first. I picked a spot about a mile and a half down a dirt trail off the highway, tucked between tall pines with an open clearing for my tent. There was no one else around. I set up camp, gathered firewood, and got myself settled before the sun dipped behind the trees. By late afternoon, the air had gone heavy, the kind of heaviness that presses down on your chest before a storm. The forest had that quiet feeling to it too, like even the birds and squirrels had gone still. I kept an eye on the sky, hoping it might blow over, but right before dark the rain came. At first just a sprinkle tapping on the pine needles, then hard drops pelting the ground, and soon after it was coming down steady. I got a fire going for a while, but the rain eventually put it out. By nightfall I was inside my tent, listening to water drip from the trees and roll across the tarp. It was maybe around 10 at night when I first felt something wasn't right. The rain had started to ease, but the woods outside sounded wrong. Usually in the rain, especially once it lightens up, you hear frogs, crickets, small movements in the brush. Instead, it was silent. I lay there, staring at the top of the tent, listening to the empty noise. That was when I thought I heard footsteps. Not the soft scurry of an animal, but actual heavy steps on wet ground. Slow, spaced out, like someone walking carefully. My first thought was that maybe another camper had wandered close, maybe lost or looking for a dry spot. But the closest campground was over 5 miles away, and my truck was the only vehicle I'd seen on that dirt road. I held my breath and listened. The steps stopped for a long moment, and then I heard them again, closer this time. I unzipped the tent just a few inches and peeked out. The rain had left the ground muddy, and the trees glistened under the dim light of the moon breaking through the clouds. I didn't see anyone. I told myself it might have been a deer or an elk, since they do move slow sometimes, but deep down it didn't feel like that. Animals in the woods don't make the hair on your arms stand up the way this did. I stayed awake, sitting upright in my sleeping bag, my rifle leaning against my shoulder. Hours passed with nothing but the occasional drip of water outside. Finally, sometime after midnight, I must have dozed off. The next thing I knew, I woke to the sound of something brushing against the side of my tent. Not a branch, not the wind. It was deliberate, like fingers dragging across the fabric. My chest tightened, and I stayed completely still. The brushing came again, longer this time, and then stopped. My breathing was so loud in my own ears, I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. I slid my hand onto the rifle and waited. The silence after that felt endless. After a while, I gathered enough courage to unzip the tent and shine my flashlight out. The beam cut through the trees, shaking a little from my hand. That was when I caught sight of something moving between the trunks about 30 yards out. It was tall, too tall to be a person, but thin, almost awkward in the way it shifted its weight. The flashlight only hit it for a second before it ducked behind a tree. My stomach dropped. I wanted to convince myself it was a trick of the light, maybe a branch, but I knew what I saw. I pulled my rifle close, flicked the safety, and sat there for what felt like hours, staring out into the woods, flashlight in one hand, gun in the other. Around 3 or 4 in the morning, the rain picked up again, steady sheets that drowned out every other noise. I never saw the figure again, but I couldn't sleep. Every crack of a branch outside made my body jump. My tent felt smaller and smaller, like a trap I had walked right into. When the gray light of dawn finally broke, I crawled out of the tent, stiff from sitting upright all night. The ground around my camp was torn up with mud, and I noticed tracks. They weren't boot prints, and they weren't animal either. Long, narrow impressions with toes too sharp-looking, spread farther apart than any human foot should have been. They circled my tent more than once. My stomach turned when I realized they stopped and started in odd places, like whoever left them had paused, stood there watching, then moved again. I broke camp as fast as I could, shoving my gear into the pack without caring how it fit. I didn't even bother to cook breakfast or dry anything out. The whole time I felt eyes on me, like something was just out of sight between the trees. My hands shook as I threw everything into the back of the truck and climbed in. The tires spun in the mud before they caught and pulled me out of that clearing. The rain let up halfway back to the highway, and when I finally hit pavement, I let myself breathe again. I didn't stop until I was back in Phoenix, the city lights looking safer than I'd ever seen them. I didn't tell many people about that night. The ones I did laughed it off, saying it must have been a coyote or my imagination running wild in the dark. But I know what I saw. I know the feeling of being watched, hunted even, and those tracks around my tent weren't anything I've ever seen before or since. I still camp, but never alone anymore. And I've never gone back to that part of Arizona. Every time it rains at night and I hear the soft tapping on my roof, I'm back in that tent, clutching my rifle, waiting for those steps to come again. I had always liked the idea of getting away from people for a few days, and in the summer of 2003, I finally made the trip I had been putting off. I was 28 at the time, living in Illinois, and I had a beat-up green Ford Explorer that I trusted enough to carry me into the woods of northern Wisconsin. I picked a state forest that wasn't as popular as the bigger parks. I wanted something quiet, away from kids, RVs, and crowded campsites. I packed light, tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, a hunting knife, and a cooler with some food and water. I thought I was ready for the kind of solitude I told myself I needed. I drove up a winding gravel road that eventually cut off into dirt. It was mid-afternoon when I found a small clearing off the path, about 100 yards from a lake. The water looked clean and calm, dark green from the pine trees reflecting off it. There were no other cars, no campsites marked, no signs of people at all. That was exactly what I wanted. I set up the tent near the tree line and built a small fire ring with rocks I found around the area. By evening, I was sitting by the flames with a cheap folding chair, cooking a can of beans, feeling like I had made the right choice. When the sun went down, it got quiet, so quiet it was almost too much. No cars, no planes, no voices. Just the crackle of my fire and the occasional splash from the lake. The silence felt heavy, and though I told myself it was peaceful, I couldn't ignore how far away from everything I was. That night, lying in my sleeping bag, I heard noises in the woods. At first just branches breaking, then what sounded like slow footsteps. I held my breath and listened hard. They didn't come close to the tent, and eventually I convinced myself it was a deer moving around. The second day went well. I hiked around, collected some wood, swam in the lake. I started to relax, thinking maybe I had just been spooked the night before. But around dusk, I noticed something strange. On the far side of the lake, maybe a couple 100 yards away, there was movement. At first I thought it was an animal, but then I realized it was a person, a man. He was standing at the edge of the trees, just looking across the water. I couldn't see details, just a tall figure, dark clothes, no hat. He didn't move much. I waited for him to wave, call out, or do something that normal campers would do when they spotted someone else. But he didn't. He just stood there. I looked away for a second to poke the fire, and when I looked back, he was gone. I told myself maybe it was just another hiker cutting through, but the way he stood there made my skin crawl. Still, I stayed. I didn't want to overreact, but I noticed I kept checking over my shoulder, and that night I barely slept at all. On the third day, things started to feel worse. I went for a short walk around noon, following a deer trail deeper into the woods. After about half an hour, I came across something that froze me. In a small clearing, there was the remains of a fire pit. Blackened logs and ash, not fresh but not old either. Around it were beer cans, a torn piece of blue tarp, and bones. Animal bones, I told myself, though I couldn't be sure. They were small, picked clean, scattered. Some still had dark stains. I didn't like how it looked. It didn't feel like a normal campsite. The mess felt rushed, careless, almost like whoever had been there didn't care if anyone found it. I headed back fast, sweat running down my back despite the cool air. By the time I got to my camp, I had decided I was going to leave the next morning. It wasn't worth the uneasy feeling anymore. That night, the noises came back. Only this time, they were closer. I heard twigs snapping, leaves rustling, deliberate movements circling the tent. I lay completely still, heart pounding. I gripped the hunting knife in my sleeping bag, staring at the thin nylon walls of the tent. Every tiny sound seemed amplified in the silence. Eventually, it went quiet again, but I didn't fall asleep. At first light, I packed everything into the Explorer. The forest felt different now. Too empty, too quiet, like it was holding its breath. I drove down the dirt road, feeling relief just to be leaving. But as I turned onto the gravel path, I saw something that made me slam the brakes. Off to the right side, tucked between the trees, was a vehicle. An old beige pickup with rust along the wheel wells. The driver's side door was open. There was no one in sight. I sat there for a minute, engine idling, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to check it out, but another part told me to keep driving. I chose to leave. About 20 miles down the road, I stopped at a gas station. I told the clerk there was an abandoned truck back on the forest road, thinking maybe someone had broken down. He just nodded like he'd heard it before. I made it back home that evening, exhausted, with an uneasy weight that stuck to me for days. I kept going over it in my head. The man across the lake, the bones, the circling steps at night, the truck in the woods. It all fit together in a way I didn't want to admit. Someone had been out there watching me, maybe following me, maybe waiting for something. A week later, I checked the local Wisconsin news online, just out of curiosity. I found a small article about hunters reporting an illegal campsite in the same forest. Rangers had investigated and found signs of poaching, trash, and remains of multiple animals. They suspected someone had been living out there off and on. No arrests were made. The article was short, barely a few paragraphs, but it was enough. That confirmed what I had already felt in my gut. I hadn't been alone out there. Whoever that man was, he wasn't camping for fun. And I had been sleeping less than 100 yards from the kind of person who lives in the woods without wanting to be found. I told myself I'd never camp alone again, and I never have.